Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Witch of Napoli by Michael Schmicker. Narrated by Derek Perkins. I shall not commit the fashionable stupidity of regarding everything I cannot explain as a fraud. Dr. Carl Jung, Speech to the Society for Psychical Research, 1919. 1. Alessandra is dead. Sunday's edition should fly off the newsstands, with the photos Giorgio shot, the stuff we discovered in Lombardi's diaries, the interviews we did with the Vatican and the police, the comments we've gathered from the rich and famous throughout Europe. When I got back from the burial last night, the editorial offices at the Messaggero were dark, but the lights were burning bright in the print shop and the presses were thundering away. I climbed up the stairs to my office and found a copy-boy waiting outside the door with the front page, the ink still wet. I hung my hat and coat on the hook, then sat down at my desk to study it. Antonio did a good job on the lead. Dateline, Rome, Italy, April the 20th, 1918. Alessandra Poverelli, the fiery, vulgar Neapolitan peasant who levitated tables and conjured up spirits of the dead in dimly lit seance rooms all across Europe, whose psychic powers baffled science, captivated aristocracy, and enraged the Catholic Church, has joined the spirit world herself at age 60. Requiescat in pace. A bit melodramatic? Perhaps. But after 4 years of this damn endless war, and the Kaiser's troops threatening Paris once again, our readers are desperate for a little scandal and amusement, and as the editor of the Messaggero, I pride myself on giving the customer what he wants. Alessandra got what she wanted, too. When the consumption finally claimed her, I made sure she was buried as she wished, here in Rome, not Naples, and quietly and privately, without any religious mumbo-jumbo. I rode in the hearse with her corpse out to the city cemetery, accompanied by Maria, the nurse who took care of her the last month of her life. A light rain was falling, and the team of horses plodded up the muddy hill, her pine casket covered by a sheet of canvas in the back of the wagon. When we got there, 2 gravediggers were standing under a dripping oak tree smoking cigarettes. They quickly tossed their butts and doffed their hats, and asked when the priest would be showing up. The hole was ready, and they obviously wanted to get it over with quickly so they could return home. "There won't be any priest," I told them. They looked bewildered. "Signore, no prayers either?" "No prayers." They shrugged and clambered up onto the wagon to haul down the casket. Maria huddled under her parasol, sniffling into a handkerchief as they lowered the box into the ground. Before they grabbed their shovels, I walked over and tossed into the grave the famous photograph I had taken of Alessandra back in Naples so many years before. In minutes they had filled the hole, leaving a brutal black scar on the earth which spring will quickly heal. It's going to take me a lot longer. Here's to Alessandra, the Witch of Napoli, wherever she finds herself now. 2. I owe her. Alessandra was my first photograph for the Mattino, the assignment that launched my newspaper career. Of course, she owed me as well. My photo made her famous. She could finally escape Pigotti and get out of that shithole Naples. She never forgot that. Did I ever tell you how we first met? In the spring of 1899, my Uncle Mario owned a photography shop in Naples, and he hired me to lug his camera up to Vesuvius and take photos for him, which he printed and sold to German and French tourists. He paid me 5 centesimi for each postcard he sold, but everybody was hawking the same scenic views, and I was always hungry. So I convinced him to shoot some dirty pictures, like the ones he smuggled home from Paris. Our best seller was a girl wearing a nun's cornet, with a rosary dangling between her 2 ciocce. It sold like crazy. We doubled our sales, but Zio Mario didn't double my fee. He was a cheap bastard. A month later, a sub-editor from the local paper, the Mattino, stopped by the shop, thumbed through the photos, and asked if I wanted to work for the newspaper. "He works for me," Uncle Mario told him. "The hell I do," I said. "I quit." I was 16 years old. When the Mattino sent me out to do that first story on her, Alessandra was almost 40 years old. She was performing weekly seances at the apartment of Dr. Ercole Rossi, a professor of philosophy at the University of Naples and the head of the Spiritualist Society of Naples. He was her principal admirer at that time. She was a medium. Mediums talk to the dead, passing on messages from spirits on the other side to family and friends they've left behind in this world. When you're from Naples, you believe in these things, and the town was starting to talk about her. Alessandra was special, what spiritualists call a physical medium. She could talk to the dead, but she could also levitate tables, make things fly through the air, and do other spooky things. Professor Rossi attended one of Alessandra's seances, watched a chair waltz itself across the floor without anyone touching it, and converted to spiritualism. Rossi wrote a letter to the Mattino about what he witnessed, and Venzano, our editor, sniffed a good story. The seance and table-tilting craze was sweeping Europe. D.D. Home was entertaining royals in England with his psychic tricks, and the Pope was issuing papal bulls warning us about talking to spirits, so why not do a story on our own Alessandra? "Get a shot of her with Dr. Rossi," he told me. "Then get back right away. I want it in the morning edition." At 7:30 that evening, I knocked on the door of Rossi's apartment, and the maid led me into the parlour, where Rossi and a small group of older, well-dressed men and women were gathered in a circle, exchanging introductions and pleasantries. When Rossi spotted me, he excused himself and walked over. "So you're the boy from the Mattino?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "Tommaso La Bella. I'll let you decide where you want to take your picture. The séance is scheduled to begin at 8, so you need to set up your camera right away." I was unfolding my tripod when we heard a commotion and footsteps hurrying down the hall, and Alessandra burst into the parlour. "Late again. Buonasera, everyone." She yanked off her hat and tossed it onto a chair, then bent over and buttoned her boot before popping up again, clapping her hands together. "Andiamo. Let's get going." Pigotti, her thuggish manager, had followed her through the door, a cigarette in his thin lips. Alessandra's bright eyes swept the room, searching for Rossi, her host, and fell on me standing next to my camera. Rossi had warned her the Mattino was preparing a story. She opened her arms in welcome and headed over to me. "You are from the newspaper, no?" she demanded. Across the room, Pigotti glowered at me. I felt my face go red and stammered out my name. Taking both my hands in hers, she pulled me close and whispered in my ear, "Please make me look beautiful." Then she winked at me. I felt dizzy. We Italians say when you fall hard for a woman at first sight, you're struck by a colpo di fulmine, a lightning bolt. I can tell you it's true. I have no idea what Alessandra looked like when she was young. When I first showed up in her life with my camera, she had already lost her girlish figure. She wore that petit bourgeois black silk dress she always favoured for the séance room, which did her no favours, but she exuded a raw animal magnetism that left boys like me tongue-tied, and made men ignore their wives and crowd up close. But it was her eyes that really hypnotized men. Lord Carreg sent French astronomer Alain Bonnet a letter shortly after he met Alessandra for the first time. Her large eyes, filled with strange fire, sparkled in their orbits, or again seemed filled with swift gleams of phosphorescent fire, sometimes bluish, sometimes golden. If I did not fear that the metaphor were too easy when it concerns a Neapolitan woman, I should say that her eyes appeared like the glowing lava fires of Vesuvius, seen from a distance in a dark night. She certainly used them to her advantage. Unlike most women, she didn't drop her gaze when she talked with a man. She looked at you, and you could read whatever you wanted into that. She didn't care. I was utterly bewitched that night. I wasn't a virgin when Alessandra showed up. I was 16, after all. But my sexual experience was limited to Coco, the skinny, pimply-faced girl who helped run Uncle Mario's shop. She was constantly flirting with me, so one day when he left early I invited her into the storeroom. It was the first time for both of us. It took me forever to get her blouse over her head. She lay there stiff as a board with her eyes scrunched closed, and as soon as I came she pushed me off her and broke into tears. I didn't know what was going on. She was afraid I had made her pregnant, and she begged me to marry her, threatening to tell her brother if I didn't. Every time Uncle Mario left the shop, she would start to cry and throw things at me, accusing me of ruining her, and I was a heartless bastard, and her brother was going to come over to the shop and cut off my balls. A month later, she found out she wasn't pregnant and wanted me to take her to the cinema so we could fool around. Alessandra was the first woman in my life. I felt a sudden surge of jealousy when she turned her attention to Dr. Capelli, a fellow professor from the university who assisted Rossi with his psychic explorations. He was tall and handsome, with an engaging smile, and an amateur magician to boot. The two of them sat knee to knee in a corner as Capelli demonstrated a coin trick that left her laughing and searching his sleeve. Pigotti marched over, yanked her to her feet, and shoved her over to where I was setting up. He returned to his post at the door, glaring at Capelli. I posed Alessandra sitting on an armchair in the parlour, flanked by two elegant fan palms, and holding Ross's white cat in the lap of her black silk dress. When I leaned forward to square her shoulders to the camera, I could feel the heat of her body, and her dark hair touched my cheek. She looked up at me. "I've never been photographed before, Tommaso," she confessed. "Do you think I look ugly?" At first I thought she was teasing me, and then I realized she wasn't. I stared at her, dumbfounded. I wanted to shout, "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever met." Instead, all I could say was, "I think you look very nice." She reached out to touch my hand. "Grazie," she said softly. No matter how beautiful women are, they're always worried that they aren't attractive enough. They need to be reassured. A few don't, but even they appreciate the attention. The minute I fired off the photograph, Rossi began herding everyone towards the seance room. I didn't know if I would ever see Alessandra again, and it frightened me. As Rossi was closing the door, I stopped it with my foot. "I could set up my camera in the seance room," I suggested boldly. "If anything happens, I can capture a photograph of it." Behind him, I could see Alessandra settling down in her chair, and the other sitters taking their places around the table. Rossi shook his head. "Impossible. These manifestations happen very quickly and rarely last more than a few seconds." "That's all I need, sir," I replied. "A second." Rossi hesitated, hand on the doorknob. He seemed to mull it over in his head. I held my breath. "Wait here," he said finally. He retreated inside. Through the door, I could see him huddling with Alessandra and Pigotti. Pigotti didn't look very happy, but Alessandra threw a smile my way. Finally, Rossi returned to the door. I could come inside, but I had to remain in the corner with my camera. I wasn't to speak, and I couldn't take a photograph unless Rossi gave me a signal. So I hustle in my equipment, jam myself into the corner, and load my flash gun. Pigotti crowds in next to me, the stink of his body strong, his hooded eyes fixed on Alessandra. 6 people hold hands around a small, 4-legged card table. a turned-down oil lamp providing the only illumination. It's gloomy, shadowy, and hard to see. I strain my eyes. A clock on the wall quietly ticks away the minutes. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Maybe 30 minutes pass, and despite the enthusiastic prayers at the start, absolutely nothing happens. Other than Alessandra's coughing, the room is dead silent. I'm running out of time to get the photo and get back to the paper. Suddenly, the table jerks forward, and the woman in front of me lets out a gasp. Then another sudden jerk. I watch dumbfounded as the table slowly tilts backwards on two legs and balances there, a toy music box skidding off and bouncing across the floor, sounding a note. More gasps and cries. I'm ready to shit in my pants. Alessandra cries out, "Spirits, we know you are here. Show us more." The table returns to four legs, remains there for several seconds, then slowly begins to rise into the air. The sitters scramble to their feet, trying to keep their hands on the top of the table. Then it hangs there, motionless. "È fatto!" Alessandra screams. "It's done." "Now!" cries Rossi. I fire the flash, and in that split-second burst of illumination, I see the table suspended in the air 1 meter off the floor. Maronna! The woman in front of me collapses. The table crashes to the floor, and the gas lamp is quickly turned up. Alessandra is bent over, pale and panting hard, her head in her hands. She finally turns and vomits into a pan. Rossi mops the sweat from her face, and the hostess gives her a glass of water which she drools from her lips. Then Rossi goes over to Pigotti and pays him the fee. As I'm hurrying to fold up my camera, I overhear these two withered English biddies who attended the seance gushing over the miracle they just witnessed. "She's the spirit medium we've been looking for," gushes the first. "I agree," sniffs the second. "But why would God use such an uneducated, immoral woman for his divine work? Besides, she smells like a goat." And they laughed. They were damn lucky Alessandra didn't hear them. She would have thrashed them. When I developed the plate in the darkroom that night, I immediately knew I had the photograph which would make my name. The next morning, Venzano summoned me into his office and handed me a copy of the paper. My photo was splashed across the front page. Right below it, in tiny 6-point type, was my name. Photo by Tommaso Labella. It was my first byline in the business, and it appeared in the newspaper on March the 26th, 1899. Almost 20 years ago now. It's hard to believe. This morning, before Antonio started assembling the big Sunday special on Alessandra, I called him into my office, closed the door, reached into a drawer, and pulled out my private file on her. Copies of Huxley's reports, Lombardi's correspondence with other scientists, hundreds of newspaper clippings. "Look through this," I said. "You'll find a lot of good stuff. But check with me before you use anything." I explained to Antonio how I chronicled Alessandra's rise to fame every step of the way, crouching in corners of seance rooms, eavesdropping on conversations, scooping up tidbits of information to share with Venzano. I was never a pest. I keep secrets when necessary, and I always made sure my photos flattered her, right to the end. She was vain, like all women, and had a scar on her forehead which she did her best to hide with her hair. I never showed it in my photos. She told me she fell off a donkey cart as a child, but I know Pigotti gave it to her. We understood each other, I told Antonio. She knew where I came from and how far I had to climb to get to the top, just like she had to. People see me now, editor of the powerful and influential Messaggero, showing up at the Barber of Seville with a beautiful Contessa on my arm, dining with Roman nobility, dressed in castagna suits and drinking Veuve Clicquot. They don't know I started at the bottom. But I had ambition, I wanted to sit in the editor's seat, to earn my bread by the sweat of my pen, as Aretino famously put it. So I educated myself, shooting photos for the Mattino, then sneaking into the Biblioteca Nazionale on Saturday afternoons to read Manzoni and Leopardi, learning how to pen an elegant sentence, and memorizing lines from Dante and Boccaccio and Petrarca to impress my superiors. "You've probably never heard of Petrarca," I teased. Antonio looked up from the file he was thumbing through and laughed. "Let me hear you spout a few verses." I struck a pose, my hands outstretched, reaching for the stars. "Era il giorno ch'al sol si scoloraro per la pietà del suo fattore I rai." Antonio recognized it right away. He had spent a year at the university. "Petrarca's love sonnet for his unattainable Laura, no?" "Bravo, Antonio," I replied. "I've used his poetry to coax more than one lady into bed." He grinned. "Including Alessandra?" I shook my head. "I tried a few lines on her when we first met, but it sailed right over her head. She never heard of Petrarca. We always laughed about that. We were two bricconi from Naples who fooled the world. But we never forgot where we came from." What I didn't share with Antonio or anyone else at the newspaper was that I also ended up with her private diaries, 38 notebooks written in her childish, semi-illiterate scrawl, in a dialect only we Neapolitans understand, describing what she saw and did and felt in her extraordinary life, who she slept with, her feelings and desires, her memories and secrets. She trusted me to tell her story. I tell you this in confidence. Hachette in Paris has approached me to write her biography for 1,000 francs, but I turned them down, and I'll tell you why. It's a new century. The cinema is the rage now. I will give it to Pathé Frères and let them tell her story. The magic of film for a woman who produced magic right in front of our eyes. The lower classes will flock to the theatres to see her story, because she was one of them. Their Cinderella, the poor girl who escapes poverty and humiliation and ends up wearing the glass slipper. She led the life they dream about but will never taste. They'll also come because they're dying to know, like the rest of Europe, was their heroine a fraud? Did she do it with tricks and wires and sleight of hand, or did she really have supernatural powers? The answer may surprise you. 3. Alessandra was a nobody. She came from this little goat-shit village in Bari. I've seen the dump with my own eyes. Shortly after I first met her, she returned home to visit her father's grave, and I jumped at the chance to tag along. It was a hot, sticky day, and I stood in the shade of a dusty cypress tree, fanning myself with my hat as she searched around for his grave. She finally stumbled across it, overgrown with brush, the headstone knocked flat. She let out a loud curse, fell to her knees, and began ripping out the weeds, sweeping the earth, and propping the tombstone back up. She had brought some of his favourite Turkish cigarettes and a bottle of grappa, and was arranging them in front of the stone when we heard a noise. I looked back and saw a gaggle of old crones marching up the dirt road, led by the parish priest, yelling and screaming for Alessandra to get out of town, calling her a witch and a whore. Alessandra let out a howl, jumped to her feet, grabbed a stick, and chased them all the way back to the village. Alessandra wasn't afraid of anybody in this life but Pigotti and the devil. Satan was still real to us back then, when she was born. As a child, she saw eyes glaring at her in the darkness, and was frightened one night when invisible hands stripped off her bedclothes, a tidbit I made sure Antonio included in his story. She was born left-handed, a sure sign, and always wore a corno on a silver chain around her neck to protect her from the malocchio, the evil eye, just like I do. This was despite Lombardi's protestations that it made her look like some superstitious hick. The truth is, she was superstitious. She believed in omens and curses, and tried one on Huxley when things went sour for her in England. Alessandra's mother was a strega, who practiced the old religion, what some people call witchcraft. Fortunately, the newspapers never found out. When Alessandra was born, her mother refused to have her baptized. The village priest showed up at our doorstep with his bucket of holy water, demanding to douse me, but my mother slammed the door in his face, Alessandra told me. After that, villagers looked at us strangely. One boy used to throw stones at me after school and screamed that I was going to hell. Old women sitting in the piazza would cross themselves whenever they saw my mother approaching. I could see pain in her eyes as she spoke. "It must have been pretty tough," I said. "I didn't have a lot of friends, and the taunting never stopped. The summer I turned 5, I came home one day and fell on my knees and begged my mother to let me be baptized. I just wanted it to stop, to be like everyone else. She told me she couldn't, but that I would understand some day. I ran to my bedroom and flung myself on my bed and sobbed. My father came in to console me, but I drove him away. Late that night, my mother came into my room and woke me up. She told me we were going to the forest. I said, 'Why, Mamma?' And she just smiled at me. I dressed and followed her outside, and we made our way through the village. The streets were dark and silent except for the murmur of crickets and the occasional half-hearted bark of a dog woken by our footsteps. Once we got outside the walls, my mother took off her sandals and told me to do the same. She put them in the small bag she carried, and we set off again. The night air was wonderful, filled with the fragrance of lemon flowers. And above my head, so close I felt I could reach up and touch it, was this full moon. It was so beautiful it made your heart ache. My mother sang softly as we walked along, strange songs I never heard her sing at home, but which were sweet and filled my heart with happiness, even though I couldn't understand the words. But when we reached the forest, I began to be afraid. "Maybe a fox will eat us," I said, and I clung tighter to her. Once again my mother just smiled at me. She sat down, and she pulled me into her lap and held me in her arms and sang another song, and as we sat there a fox trotted out of the shadows and sat down at the edge of the trees and looked at us. I felt like my mother was singing to him, and he was listening to her. And when she finished and fell silent, he turned around and slipped back into that darkness, and I no longer felt afraid. We followed this winding path for a long time, until we reached a small clearing in the forest where a tall old tree stood. I waited there until my mother came back with these small mushrooms, and we ate them, and then she took my hands in hers, and we started to dance under the moon. As she twirled me around, my feet left the ground, and I was flying through the stars, spinning above my head, and my heart was bursting with love for my mother, and the next thing I remember, I awoke on the grass in the crook of her arm, her soft brown eyes smiling down at me. I looked up and asked her what happened, and she said I was of the blood, like her and her mother, and she would explain everything at the right time. I stopped Alessandra. "Of the blood? The old religion. You're born into it. So you're a witch?" I laughed. Alessandra glared at me. "Don't joke about things you know nothing about." I held up my hands. "Sorry." Alessandra was silent for a long time. Then she sighed. "Shortly afterwards, my mother fell sick. She sent me back to the forest to find a special herb she needed to get well, and I looked and looked, but couldn't find it, and she got sicker and sicker. Then one morning, while I was sitting at her bedside, she told me she had seen a peacock feather in her dream, and knew her time was short. I didn't understand at first, but that evening she called me and my father to her and told him to take care of me. That scared me, and I cried and begged her not to leave me, and she took my hand and drew me close and looked at me for a long time, then whispered, 'We will see each other again.'" Alessandra looked away. I said nothing. All these spirits I talk to, she said bitterly.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?